All right, everybody, so welcome back to another episode of Colton Posey Fishing. So today we're going to go into in-depth with football head jigs. Now this time of year, dog days of summer, is one of my absolute favorite times to catch bass on football head jigs. Why? You can fish them on the main lake, you can fish them in creeks, you can fish them in pockets, you can fish them under docks, you can do whatever you want to do with the jig. And this is the number one thing that I've made the most money off of is a football head jig. So either way, we're going to talk about different ways to work it. We're going to really go in depth about the whys and hows and all that stuff. We're going to show you exactly how I use my rod and stuff like that to fish this jig. So stay tuned. This is something you don't want to miss. All right, everybody, so first off, let's talk about my setup. So my setup here is a 7'3" medium heavy, it's a 13 fishing rod. Buy whatever you can afford. I suggest, going with a higher end rod, especially when it comes to jig fishing. Now this one right here in particular is not a high end rod. I just like the way the jig feels on it. It's just a real comfortable setup that I've grown to love. But either way, real quick, I want to talk about the video sponsor. So Thunderhawk Lures, if you're not familiar with them, they make a lot of hard baits, soft baits. They have their own rod series now, Taiku rods. They're really good. But either way, go to Thunderhawk Lures website, check out, I use their A10s a lot and their Sergeant lipless crankbaits, but all their products are great. Check them all out. You see Posey 20 at checkout, you get 20% off, and it helps me out a whole lot. So jigs, all right, one of the main things that I want to make sure with my jig is line. Okay, so I don't want a line that's so heavy, especially during the dog days of summer, that they can just see it all the time, or it affects the action of the bait. But I also don't want something so light that I can't bring this bait through a lot of cover or a lot of rocks, right? Because that's typically how you're going to be fishing this, is through rocks and brush and stuff like that, 99% of the time. But with that being said, I typically go with 15-pound test and I go with fluorocarbon. That way I have a limited stretch, but I also get a little bit more sensitivity out of it. Now, as far as my reel, I'm using, I think this one's a 7.5 to 1 gear ratio. So this is a little bit faster than a lot of people like to run a jig, just because you lose some of that power with torque. But I have learned personally with a 7.5 to 1, I have that speed and I still have control. But with that speed, if they pick it up and start moving with it, if you slackline this bait a lot and you get bit, they will pick it up and start running towards the middle or in another direction with it. And a lot of times it's hard to catch up to that fish, especially if you're using a slow gear ratio. So I do sacrifice a little bit of speed for, or a little bit of power for speed, but I still got that control that I need. So with the jig, this is the number one presentation that I like. This is called popping a jig. So typically what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna let that bait fall and hit bottom, right? Once I make contact with the bottom, I'll drag that bait just a little bit, just like that, and then I will pop my rod tip. Now somebody called this stroking a jig. You should call it stroking a jig or whatever. I've always referred to it as popping a jig. But I'll pop it a couple times, pick it up, shake it a few times, boom, boom. Yes, I am popping it aggressively, but a lot of times it triggers those bass to react once that bait hops. All right, so one of the other presentations that I really like to use besides popping a jig, and this is typically what I do on points, especially like, those flat points. I'm fishing the flat area where those fish are positioned up against the bottom, but let's just say they're not wanting to chase, they're not wanting something real erratic. I will typically take that bait and I'm keeping my rod at about 1 o'clock, and then I'm gonna drag that bait straight across, just like that. Keep my line tight because I'm feeling for bites. But now here's the thing, if we get a lot of wind, keeping your rod tip at 1 o'clock and pulling is gonna be really tough, right? Because it's just gonna bow your line. So if you get a lot of wind, you can put your rod down towards the water and actually pull it, just like that. All right, so as far as, dragging that jig, once that bait hits bottom, I'm gonna just pull that bait. Like I said, if there's a lot of wind, you can put your rod down towards the water and then just pull it just like that. And ticking the top of grass, ticking the top of rocks, or whatever you may be fishing, brush or any of that good stuff, you're gonna feel that bite as long as you keep it working like that. Now let's talk about docks. All right, so as far as like, fishing docks, maybe you're trying to fish, maybe you got a lot of docks on your home lake like I do. So just talking about you know, just get your bait out there wherever you're trying to position that bait, whether it's on the end of a dock or, you know, inside the dock or whatever. But I typically let that bait sink for just a few seconds, just like that, and then I will pop it. So maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pop, 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 just like that. And typically making that bait hop, so it's just fluttering up and down just like that. Especially this time of year. I mean, a lot of times you gotta either make them react, or either they want something, you know, extremely slow. So that's another thing you do. Maybe they are on jigs, but they're not wanting that real wild pop, right? So you can kind of do the same thing again. So maybe I let it sink for just a few seconds, then I pull up, slack line just a little bit, pull up, slack line just a little bit, and I'm just kind of making that bait do this right here. And a lot of times it will trigger a lot of fish who are kind of suspended, but, you know, maybe not extremely lethargic, but, you know, they really don't want to bite, you know what I'm saying? So now another thing that you want to do, and I never really paid any attention to this until I got my hands on one of these jigs, but you know, whether you're using a 90-degree line tie where the line tie is just like that, or maybe you're using a horizontal where it's straight across, I typically go with the 90-degree. I just have a lot more confidence in the 90-degree. I don't have as many issues of the bait getting hung up, especially in rocks, okay? And typically if I do get hung up in rocks, I can kind of just go around the bait and pop my line and it'll come right back up. Now grass, it's kind of give and take, especially with a football head. I don't really think it matters whether you're using a horizontal or 90-degree line tie. It's gonna have some trouble going through grass. Now, with that being said, if you're playing smart and you know exactly how tall the grass is in the water column, you can keep either or, you know, above the top of the grass. But with a 90-degree line tie, my personal preference, in my opinion, with the 90-degree, if I know exactly where that grass line is, I have no problem keeping it above it or ticking it without, you know, so much sludge and stuff like that getting on the bait. All right, so with that being said, the jig that I typically use, and I do work with this company, but I'm not just saying this because I work with this company. This is a jig that I've built confidence in, that I've won more tournaments on than anything else, and that's a G-Money jig, okay? So it's got the 90-degree line tie, multiple colors. I just highly suggest whatever colors you decide to go with, keep it simple. When it comes to jig fishing, I throw a brown jig. It may have some red in it, or it may have some green, it may have something in it. But I'm gonna throw that jig, and if they're not biting that, then I'm gonna swap to a black and blue or something like that, a dark colored jig, okay? So, I mean, if they won't bite either one of them, they just don't want a jig that day, or I'm just not around fish. So just keep your color selection simple. I typically throw the green pumpkin, and then I'll also throw Margaritaville. It's a brown jig with, you know, some June bug in the skirt. Most of them's got the living rubber skirt. This is one that they tied for me that doesn't have the living rubber. The only reason I didn't want the living rubber on some of them is because I kind of want that flutter pattern, and when it sits, I kind of want it to just kind of fold out, not just move or anything like that. So that's why I went with this. But I typically, this time of year, I'm teaming it up with some type of crawl. Okay, whether the Yum Christie crawls are great, the Strike King Rage crawls are great. I mean, just use whatever you're comfortable with using, but those are typically the two that I use. But there's you a few techniques on a jig where you can keep it simple and catch fish. Those are the two techniques that you can use, you know, year round. I suggest popping or stroking a jig, you know, as the water temperature is warm. So, you know, from really that 68 degrees and up water temp, I'm typically going to be popping a jig, okay? And, you know, as the water temperature increases, I may get more aggressive with it. Now, as it cools down, or as the water is cool, I'm going to do a lot more dragging and a lot more just sitting in place and shaking that bait. So that's one of the things that I didn't talk about. During the cooler months, I may take this bait, let it hit bottom, right? Let it just sit there, and then I'm gonna have my rod tip about 1 o'clock, and then I'm gonna sit there and shake it. And if you notice my line, watch my line right here. As I'm shaking, I've got slack line, but that bait's moving now. That's where the living rubber comes in. When I'm sitting there shaking this, just like this, and that living rubber is just moving around, and I start shaking it, it just makes it move a little bit more while it's in place. But a lot of times it just creates a lot of strikes. But you know, don't be afraid to throw a jig. I hear a lot of people, especially a lot of people that get in my boat, they tell me, you know, I just don't have confidence in jigs. You know, I need to start fishing them more, but I don't have confidence in jigs. Well, that's something that you can do and use to catch a lot more fish on jigs. Go out with it. What I suggest is doing what I do. If you really want to learn a new technique, take what I'm telling you here. Go out to the lake, have one rod, one jig, go throw it all day, exactly how I said. Stay confident in it, keep your mind on what you're doing, pay attention to what the fish are telling you, and I guarantee you'll catch more fish. Guys, I really appreciate it. Check out G Money Jigs on tacklewarehouse.com. There's some stores in California that have them in stock. You can go on G Money Jigs website, it'll tell you all the stores that have them in stock, but typically most people order them from Tackle Warehouse. Check them out. I really appreciate if you help those guys. They're great people. I've worked with them since late 2019, something like that. They actually care about their product and about the people buying their product. They hand tie them. I mean, what more do you want? But either way, guys, I appreciate it. If the video helped you at all, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe if you're new here. I'm always putting out bass fishing content. Comment down below if you have any questions. I love talking fishing with you guys. So, you know, if you got something you want to talk about fishing, just drop it down in the comments. Let's talk about fishing. That's what this channel's for. So either way, guys, I appreciate it. I'll see you next time. But all I'm doing is I'm trying to tick. Uh-oh, sir. Uh-oh, sir. Cut your pay. Cut your pay. Here you go. We'll go ahead and put it on mute or call them back, whatever you need to do. Now, with that being said, I lost what I was going to say. What was I?